Thank you for joining us again on our last of the gospel series that we're doing on the authenticity of the eyewitness accounts. We've done two going over Mark, we've done two going over Matthew, we've done two going over Luke. We did one of John, and we will finalize John today. As a way of introduction to what we're going to be doing today, I want to give us some updates in addition to finishing up John's gospel. But we will be doing Acts next. As I told you, I was trying to coordinate that with going on other programs and things like that. I really want to make the best of my time to make sure I'm keeping everything in order and organized. So if you want to check in on that soon, be ready to see something on Acts. And I think what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to take some time and actually go through each New Testament book. And then I'd like to work through some of the Old Testament as well. And I'm not necessarily going to do that in order. I might do one book in the New Testament and then go back and do five in the Old or something like that. But my goal is to actually move forward and completely do the entire Bible, giving an inside view of the internal evidence as well as the external evidence for each canonical book. So be on the lookout for that as we go through these different aspects of the Bible and its canonicity versus those that are not. Also, at times, I will stop and do books that are non-canonical and why they are not to be considered canon. Last week, we dealt with the authenticity of John. We looked at various avenues to deal with that. We talked about the Muratorian fragment, which we'll come back to in a minute, the anti-Marcionite prologue. Papias's own lineup of giving names seemed to be consistent in understanding that John's gospel was around. Irenaeus, obviously being a second generation from John, trained by Polycarp, who knew John personally, gave us information about his publication, being that it was in Ephesus in Asia Minor. Tertullian, we talked about his quote to Clement of Alexandria, which I thought were both very helpful, as well as Jerome. But today I want to kind of go back a little bit to what we dealt with in the Muratorian, focusing in on a couple of phrases. And one of the things that was stated in that fragment is that John would narrate, he would give a dictation of what took place with the help of some of his friends. And one of the things that we talked about is that there were fellow disciples and bishops that were around John trying to figure out, okay, so you should write your story. Basically, that was how they viewed this thing. Like, you should write your story about what's going to take place, what you saw, and how it was impactful for you and your viewpoint. And so John said, all right, let's pray and fast about this for 3 days. And according to the Muratorian fragment, Andrew comes along and the Lord revealed to him by the Spirit that John should do this thing and that they would help him. And the key phrasing that we looked at in that is that he said, when he came to him, that you should narrate it and you should do it in your own name, as they, being the group that's trying to help him and organize this thing, call them or recall them to mind. And that seems consistent with the internal evidence, as we talked about already, because if you go back to the gospel, John is telling the story of not just himself, the disciple whom the Lord loved, but he also introduces stories that the others do not contain, which we saw that from the writings of the anti-Marcionite prologue, as well as other church fathers. John was very familiar with the other three accounts. In fact, he approved them and said they were true. He didn't have any issues to correct as much as he realized that there was more to the story than they offered, because the primary witness behind all that they were containing was really the primary star witness of Peter that Matthew would have corroborated with, Luke certainly would have utilized. And so there was this necessity to kind of give the other side of the things too, because there were things Peter didn't see, although he was one of the three, but so was John. And John had a viewpoint that Peter did not. Peter was active in his ministry as a disciple. John stayed very near to Jesus. He stayed very close to him. He was the disciple who laid on Christ's breast. He was the disciple there at the foot of the cross, holding a mother who's watching her child die. And Jesus said, behold your mother, behold your son. John ended up becoming the caregiver of Mary. So he had a side of things that Peter did not have. He tells a side of the story that Peter did not tell. He almost finalizes both ends of the story that Peter was able to give in Rome, that others would have utilized, like Matthew and Luke. And John is actually able to kind of give a second half, a bigger view. Peter's view was fine. There was nothing wrong with it, but John was able to see an outside view of Peter and Jesus. And then he was able to sit back and interpret, which is one of the amazing things that Clement of Alexandria kind of honed in on, the fact that the Gospel of John was a spiritual gospel. And we dealt with that. And as Burskog made mention, that when you talk about John particularly, he was not just an eyewitness, but an interpreter of what was eyewitnessed. And admittingly throughout the gospel, like in chapter 12, he states that he and the other disciples did not understand these things until after Jesus was glorified. So there was a spiritual application, not just a visual understanding and saying, well, this is what happened, this is where it happened. It's actually being able to say why it happened. And John is able to give us a spiritual aspect in doing that. But it was a group effort, really. It was actually John being the main guy, but he was able to tell the story of Andrew, which we don't see in the Synoptics. You see that in chapter 1 of John, this anonymous disciple, and then Andrew is actually the one that introduced Peter to Jesus. And we see that in John's gospel, but not in the Synoptics. Now, if you follow the pattern to the end of the book, the other disciple that was there with Andrew is, by comparison and the usage, the disciple whom the Lord loved, which was John. So he was there before Peter as a disciple, and he was there after Peter. And so he's able, after Peter's death, to give a broader story and a broader vision to the things that happened amongst them. And he's able to write it in addition to Andrew's story, and maybe perhaps Thomas, who gets a line and a story in John's gospel that are not in the Synoptics. And he even mentions Judas, not Iscariot. Perhaps he was still alive, but he was motivated to get this thing done, and the churches wanted it in writing. As John was getting older, I mean, think about this, as he's getting older, he's going to die, and that tradition is going to die with him. But if he could put it into writing, it could be done. And we talked about how beautiful the writing is of John. Though a simplistic gospel in its usage of vocabulary, it is very complex and organized in its structure. And the only way I can reconcile this, and I actually had lunch with my daughter's soccer coach about this, Michael, and we talked about this at lunch. Like, the beauty of that is you see that the word choice, the narrating of it, is simplistic, which John, being a fisherman by trade growing up, would use a simpler vocabulary. But the ability to structure it the way that it was done, I don't believe John was able to do that, or his education level would allow him. But he was in the city of Ephesus, and Ephesus was not limited to by any stretch scribes. And I think that John used scribes that were there in Ephesus to do some of the work for him. And I think he narrated it, as the Muratorian fragment states. And it's also stated by some of the other fathers as well that that's the way it would have gone. It would have been narrated, it would have been dictated, and somebody would have written it down for him. Now, there is some quotations that actually say that Papias was one of the writers. I'm not so sure I follow that tread. It could be. Maybe he was. He was a hearer of John, and he was obviously familiar with the format, as we discussed. But I don't know if he was there or not. Maybe he was. Maybe he was not. But John the Apostle was able to make this thing happen on behalf of the apostles that were still alive, telling his story and their story and the understanding of what they saw in the ministry of Jesus. So then the question is constantly asked in all four gospels, really, but especially here as we're talking about John. Well, then why didn't John just plainly say he's the writer? Like, why didn't John do that? Well, again, and I've said this on this program, I'll say it again if you're listening for the first time, whether you're watching this on Facebook Live or YouTube Live, or you're going to listen in later on the podcast Facts. This was not the practice of historians at the time when giving a biography of another person to insert your name and to make yourself the point or the involvement, even if you're involved, not to make yourself the point of that scene. And what often would happen, and this is not just something that the four gospels did, like ancient historians often use a third person or use code name or use some sort of epithet or use some sort of descriptive name or location, or as in John's case, the disciple whom Jesus loved. When you have these things in these early writings of biographies, it is not just limited to the four gospels. When you have historians, they use a third person often, referring to themselves as an observer of these events. Even Luke did that. He kept himself out of it when he wasn't there. When he became a part of it, as we'll see in Acts, you start seeing we, us, our. This is true in other writings of Xenophon, Thucydides, Polybius, Julius Caesar, Josephus, Lucian. Others did this same thing. This is not unique to the four gospels. So number one, this was not the practice of historical times in that era. Two, historians were careful not to make biographical works about themselves. Now, John does do something that other historians do. He does say we and our testimony. We know his testimony is true, dealing in the last chapter there. And letting you know, I'm the one writing. The one that heard those things is the one that is writing these things to you. So he's a little bit more upfront, I guess you could say, than the rest of them when it comes to including himself in there. But we saw with Mark, there was more of the inclusio eyewitness. John does the same thing. Matthew used his own epithet and gave his own credentials by understanding taxation laws, temple tax, things that other writers didn't. Luke, we saw all the physician terms. They were just replete in just Luke alone, that he was trained in the way of the medicines and trained as a physician by the ancient Greeks, like Hippocrates and others. So there are major things that we look at when we deal with these gospels, and we don't see anything in them that is unrealistic or unprecedented or something that is just out of this world, different from the rest of the historical times. They are consistent with the times. And so the historians or these biblical writers in these gospels were careful about not making themselves the point. So the question should not be, well, why didn't John just plainly say he was the writer? Like, why didn't he just say, I, John, write these things to you? The real question should be, why did the 2nd and 3rd century gospels explicitly use names? When you're talking about, say, the gospel of Judas, the gospel of Mary, the gospel of Thomas, these other writings of a pseudo-apocryphal works, if you would. Why is it that they use names? The gospel of Peter. He even says, I, Simon Peter, and my brother Andrew, at the very end of the fragment. Why is it that they use names? That's the real question. It's not why didn't these not use names. If these were true to the times of writing, you would actually find names no longer involved in the discussion. You would find the techniques like we've been discussing all along, and it's true as other writings with Xenophon and Polybius and Julius Caesar, etc. But here, we don't see that. Here, it is different. It follows in those times. And then in the 2nd and 3rd century, all of a sudden it's I Thomas and I Mary. You know, you start seeing them bring their names in it to gain credibility. But that's really the problem here. They're the ones that are out of touch with the writings of the time. Bauckham puts it this way: the use of the third person keeps the author as the author, hidden behind the narrative as he or she is in the rest of the narrative. A third reason why John didn't just plainly say he was the writer is what is called direct autopsy. This is what Burskog calls the author who is involved in an event that qualifies him to be the writer, but also a writer and a reliable witness that is doing the writing. This is similar to the idea of what Josephus said about himself. This is what Josephus said in his writings. He said, my qualifications as a historian of the war was that I had been an actor in many and an eyewitness of most of the events. And this is exactly what I think John is getting at in chapter 21, verse 24, which I'll read for you. Now, let me read that quote again so that you catch on to what I'm saying, since I don't have it pulled up for you this week if you're watching this live. Josephus said, my qualification as a historian of the war was that I had been an actor in many and an eyewitness of most of the events. And so we see Josephus actually use his historical writings when he's there versus when he's not there. He changes the way he's writing of those events when he became the eyewitness. You see the same technique you see, for example, like in John. And in John 21:24, that's probably what's going on here. It says, this is the disciple who is testifying about these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. So you have that similar idea there of this direct autopsy. So what does that look like? What does that play out to be in John's gospel particularly? What are the areas of direct autopsy that Burskog's talking about, that Bauckham and Jesus and the eyewitnesses dealing with, that similarity to Josephus? What are some areas of direct autopsy in John? Let me give you a few. Number one, John shared intimate times with Jesus that was separate from the others. This is seen with him with the constant statement of Jesus being the one that has a disciple that is laying on his breast, like you see in John 13:23 through 26. So John was able to see things not just from a distance, but actually very close. Number two, John was faithful to remain with Jesus at the cross when the others did not, like in chapter 19, verse 26 through 27. So John is there. He's on the scene. He's as Josephus said, I was a eyewitness of most, but also an actor in those. I saw them and participated in them. John was saying the same thing, but he was able to, as I stated, go after an area that really one-ups a little bit some of the synoptics because he's interpreting the event as well. But he has a side of things where it's almost like he and Peter, through the Gospel of Mark, are in this friendly competition, as I listed and titled today's session. It's not a bad thing. Like, the gospel writers being competitive is actually a good thing in some ways, because they're on the same team. This idea that you hear in secular scholarship and skepticism and atheism is, oh, well, they're correcting the other one and they disagree with this guy and they're fixing it and all that. It's like, well, no. John approved of the other gospels. So he's obviously not interested in correcting anybody and saying, well, they blew it, let me go fix all this mess. That's not the point of what John was doing. He approved it and helped publish them, calling them true. What he's doing is he's filling in gaps, going earlier than the synoptics to the very first miracle of Jesus at the wedding of Cana. And he's also filling in gaps that the synoptics did not cover, and they couldn't cover because they're based really on Peter's eyewitness testimony and Matthew and some of those that were in Jerusalem. But here he's able to tell stories from a position that the others could not. He's able to tell you a story from the very nearness to the very body of Jesus, where he was leaned on his breast, where he was able to be at the cross in John 19, where the others had abandoned and fled. He takes Mary in chapter 20, verse 17 as his own mother, if you would, by taking care of her, providing for her in his own home. This is something that Matthew didn't have. This is something that Peter didn't have. There is an actor, if you would, for lack of a better term, in the play that he's writing about. He didn't just see it, he participated in it. He didn't just see it and participate, he saw and participated in things that others did not, and that's why his story needed to be shared. Here's another direct autopsy. John is given the greatest privilege and honor with Jesus than Peter. John is given a greater privilege of honor with Jesus than Peter. You say, well, come on, you're making this competitive. No, I'm not making it competitive. Again, I don't think they're against each other. That's why I say it's friendly competition. They're on the same team, but there are realities where certain disciples saw more, knew more, or were able to be given opportunities. In John 21, verse 7, it says, therefore, the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. So when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for his works. He threw himself into the sea. So what's going on here? John was able to see and recognize something about Jesus before Peter did. Peter then went after what he was understanding and seeing. So you see some of this beauty come out in John's perspective. Baca makes the argument that Peter and John represent two types of disciples. They're not competition in the sense of against each other trying to win out, as much as it's a friendly competition. And again, you see some of these things like when they're running to the tomb, you have Peter and John are two of the disciples who see the empty tomb. And John makes sure to let you know that he beat Peter to the tomb. He was faster. I don't know if Peter was an extra 15 pounds from John, a little heavier, or John worked out more. Whatever the reason may be, John wanted you to know he beat Peter there. There's like this friendly competition where when John did something that was better or recognized something better than Peter, he let you know that. Again, it's not for like one-up points to say I'm better than Peter. It is simply what I call friendly competition, where he's showing you he understood things about Jesus that needed to be told, that even he had to help Peter see. So Baca basically says when you tear this down, you have Peter and John, they're representatives of two types of disciples: active service and perceptive service. Active service, perceptive service, or a perceptive witness. Peter was the active in following Jesus to the point of failure and thankfully restoration. Like Peter was a ground guy. He didn't waste no time. He may have got his foot stuck in his mouth like he did quite frequently. He may have made wrong decisions out of haste like he did, but at the same time, he was an active follower of Jesus, and he followed him actively to the point of failure and into restoration. And we see a beautiful story of restoration for Peter when we find ourselves at Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 3, when he's preaching at Pentecost at the temple. The Lord greatly restored Peter. But he would be considered what's an active service apostle, whereas John was a faithful listener and a student throughout. And this seems to be the perception that all the apostles have of John, because even when you go to Luke's writing of Acts 2:3, you find Peter doing all the talking, but John is standing right next to him. I find it ironic that it says, and they said to him, they being Peter and John, or they spoke and said this, being Peter and John, and then it quotes Peter. Peter's words are recorded, but it says they said them. I find that ironic. So it seems to be that the regular case, and again, Peter and John are buddies. Like they're working together in the book of Acts. They're together teaching and preaching and creating content and building the church, really. They're on the same team. So what John actually does to the first gospel, in my opinion, the Greek gospel being Mark, I think Matthew's gospel, as I stated before, there was a Hebrew gospel of Matthew that was published before Mark. If you missed that, go back and listen to those. You can find those on YouTube, or if you're listening on the podcast, they're on the Facts podcast. Why I believe Matthew's Greek gospel is second. It's like John is concluding, finalizing the work of the apostles through the gospel narratives. You had a group effort in Matthew. And again, if you missed that, you can go by and hear the reasons why I believe that. You have a group effort in Matthew. You have Peter's testimony in Mark. Luke is a compilation of multiple followers of Jesus and getting their story and sharing it. And John is now telling his story with the group that's still left, Andrew being one of them, perhaps Thomas, perhaps Judas, not Iscariot. He's telling their story too. And it's like he's finishing this out. He's taking what's incomplete and making it complete. Kind of what Irenaeus said, that there were 4 gospels. There had to be 4, no less, no more. It's like John is finalizing, finishing out what was started by Peter, and they worked together, being 2 of the 3 that were part of the inner circle, James being killed very early on. They're 2 of the 3 that were left in the inner circle of Jesus, and they are writing the story of Christ. And Peter started it, and John is finishing it. That seems to be the way they're portrayed even in other writings, that Peter is the active and John is the faithful listener and observer and a student who eventually collects the thoughts and puts them into words. And it took John longer to do that than Peter, who is an active apostle. I see that consistent even in the narratives we have of them. It's not that Peter's lesser than John, as I stated, but that God's grace is able to restore man and use him as a great shepherd to the church, which is what Peter was. John's role was going to be longer, more futuristic in comparison to Peter's. This could be why John expressed Peter's death in comparison to what his own would look like. At the very end, he almost expresses a little bit about how Peter died, because it even states as much. This is the death that he would experience, as if he's writing after Peter's death, which again, I believe John is written somewhere between 80 and 90 AD. I believe he is writing after the fact. That's why he unveiled, if you missed it last week, multiple people's names that the synoptics were protecting through protective anonymity. But here he speaks of Peter, because Peter was like, well, what about this guy over here? Jesus said, hey, follow me. He said, but what about him? Talking about John. And Jesus says, what difference does it make? If I have him live to the very end here, like that, what's that got to do with you? You follow me. He gives him. He says, Jesus said to him, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. Therefore, this account went out among the brothers, and the disciples would not die. Yet Jesus did not say that he would not die, but only if you wanted him to remain until he comes. What is that to you? And John says, this is the disciple who's testifying these things, because he's the one that saw that and observed it. But he seems to tell Peter as to what kind of death he would die earlier in that section. And John's almost looking back at that, realizing that what Jesus said to them that day, that John would be a longer abiding apostle in a way than Peter. So John was a disciple of Jesus before Peter. He was one of the 2. He was the anonymous one with Andrew that came along. And it was Andrew that brought Peter to Jesus. And then at the end of the book, you have Peter once again still being talked about to the very end, but he does not get the last statement. John, the one who's writing these things, who observed, who leaned on his breast, is getting the last statement. He's the beginning of the narrative, and he's at the end of the narrative, just like Peter is the first disciple on the scene in Mark's gospel, and he's the last one on the scene when it says, and tell my brethren, and tell Peter. You see that inclusio eyewitnesses going on between the 2 gospels there. You find this aspect where John understood what Jesus was saying on the seashore that day. He realized there was great significance of what he was telling Peter to what he was telling John. Bauckham expresses 4 ways that John was portrayed as an ideal witness. He really is in a lot of ways. He gives 4, and I agree with these 4, and I'll share them with you, where John is expressed and portrayed as the ideal witness. Number 1, John was able to be a follower of Jesus before Peter and long after. Just said that. 2, John was at key events in Jesus' story that Peter was not, as we talked about. And again, he was there. Let me give you some extras. He was there when John the Baptist came on the scene and said, behold, the Lamb of God, which takes away the sin of the world, in John 1:35. Later, he was able to see the blood, that same blood that he heard John proclaim, the Lamb of God, which takes away the sin of the world, that bloodshed that'll take away the sin. he was able to see that same blood and water flow from the very body of Jesus at the foot of the cross in chapter 19. He was there. John's on-the-spot eyewitness reports include more details than in other places in the account where he's not there. So again, John is relying on others, but it's ironic when the disciple who Jesus loved is on the scene. You can start seeing details, not generic statements, specific statements. Tovey said at every point where the beloved disciple appears, the narrative includes items of close detail which suggests on-the-spot eyewitness report. I'll give examples. In John 1:39, John gives the hour in this chapter and section and verse of when Jesus invited him and Andrew to go with him to the location he stayed in. Now, how would John know the hour unless he was there? How would John know what took place in that tent where he went with Jesus and Andrew? So if I go to chapter 1, verse 39, this is what it says. And again, these are the details that Tovey is talking about. And he said to them, come and you will see. And they came and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him in that day. And it was about the 10th hour. Why? Where did that come from? Well, he's on the spot, if you would. He's an on-the-spot witness. Whereas in other places where he's not on the scene, you have generic statements. When he's on the scene, more specific. Another one, Jesus dipping a piece of bread and giving it to Judas in chapter 13 and verse number 26. Now, again, you say, well, that's not a big deal. It is a big deal because these are things that are not mentioned elsewhere that John is there for, and he's giving you details. And he would know that because he was right there with Jesus, and right on the other side was Judas. He was not only closest to Jesus that night, he was closest to Judas, being that close to Jesus. He heard and saw things happen. John 13, in verse number 26. Jesus then answered, that man is the one whom I dip the piece of bread and give it to him. So when he dipped the piece of bread, he took it and gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Details. Dipped it, gave it to Judas. You don't see this kind of language in the synoptics. A third one. Details of the two different scenes of the fire in chapter 18, verse 15 through 18. When you compare it to Mark 14:54. And then later in John 21, verse 9. So, two fire scenes. The first fire scene and the last fire scene, which we were just talking about in chapter 28. In the end of chapter 21, verses 8 and 9. But I do find that there's two fire scenes that he focuses on that are far more detailed. The first one is when Peter is actually being around the campfire himself with Malchus's relative, and he was questioned, and then he denied the Lord. And then chapter 21, verse 9, you have far more detail. The amount of fish that they caught, the location, what was said, what was done. Even when Jesus was making statements about the length of time that he would want John to be alive and say to Peter, you just follow me. He had a lot of details at these two different scenes of the campfire. In chapter 18, verse 15, he talks about Peter and what happened to him. But if you compare that with Mark 14, it's very different. And I'll read it really quick in chapter 18, verse 15. It says, Simon Peter was following Jesus, so was another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest, and he entered in with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter was standing at the door outside. So the other disciple, who was not known to the high priest, went out and spoke with the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. Then the slave woman, who was the doorkeeper, said to Peter, you are not also one of the man's disciples, are you? The man's disciples, are you? And he said, I am not. And then this is where the denial comes in. The other disciple was John. The others went hiding. Peter was following behind quietly. John was at the forerunner. He was fine at that night with dying, apparently, if it meant So, I mean, he was at the foot of the cross. So he has information because he went ahead of Peter. And he's telling you details that Mark 14:54 does not have. More details. Chapter 21, verse 9, again, he has multiple things that he can tell us about that campfire that Peter did not. A fourth one. An observation of Jesus' legs not being broken, but rather blood and water flowing from his side after being stabbed in chapter 19, verse 33 through 35. Pretty vivid, pretty detailed. But after they came to Jesus, they saw he was already dead. They did not break his legs. Yet one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, so that you also may believe. For these things took place so that the scripture would be fulfilled. Notice how John made sure to tell you his legs were not broke. They took a spear, and out came blood and water. And I know that because I was there. He didn't flat out say it in the first person, but he's letting you know I was there. I saw it happen. I'm testifying these things, and we know it's true. The linen wrappings were folded and placed at the end of where Jesus laid in chapter 20, verse 6 through 8. And again, Peter was there. John was there. But Peter was active there. Again, there's that active. He didn't take notice of the details that John was an observer and paying attention and a student of. Chapter 20, verse 6. So Simon Peter also came following him, and he entered the tomb and looked, and linen wrappings were laying there. Again, he letting you know, hey, I beat Peter to the tomb. And the face cloth, which had been on his head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but folded up in a place by itself. So the other disciple who had first come to the tomb, being John, also entered, and he saw and believed. But notice he recognized the face cloth, and where it was laid, not lying with the linen wrappings, but folded in a place by itself. He recognized details about the cloth itself and the rest of the wrappings. That's incredible. Details. Why? He was there. John gives the exact number of fish, 153 that were caught in chapter 21, verse 10 through 12. He must have been in charge of counting that night. So there you go. I mean, there are ways that he is portrayed as an ideal witness. And these are information that you're given of his on-the-spot eyewitness reports. So there's three of the ways that he is an ideal witness. He was able to follow Jesus before Peter and long after. He was at key events to the story of Jesus that Peter wasn't at. He had on-spot eyewitness reports of great detail when he was there versus when he wasn't there. And fourth, lastly, John is portrayed as a perceptive witness, which we've hinted at this whole time. Peter has eyewitness testimony of an empty tomb. Same one that John does, that we just read in 28 through 9. But John was able to perceive the significance and the meaning to the point of believing. He believed. And that's something that happens over and over and over again in his gospel. Again, him and Peter are not at odds with one another, but they will tell their story from their perspectives. Mark portrays Peter as a disciple who loved Jesus and places high emphasis on that. He loved him. John portrays John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, as the one that Jesus loved, and make sure to place a high emphasis on that. Mark makes sure you know Peter loved Jesus. John makes sure you know Jesus loved John. It doesn't mean that Jesus didn't love Peter, and it doesn't mean that John didn't love Jesus. But that's the emphasis, the perspective, the viewpoint, the distinction in their design of disciple. They're not the same guy. Naturally, we have the two different sides. It's a beautiful setup. And I love the fact that these things are being shown in the gospel. And I think it's something that we ought to take heed to and to evaluate, to bring out the majesty in these things. Because folks, let me pause right here and just rant for a minute. I get weary and exhausted with much of the nonsense that is said about the four gospels. Well, they're just forgeries, and these things, they're much, much later. Nobody there was writing these things. And let me say this. I've given multiple reasons as to why those things are ridiculous. And the fact that they cannot produce one single location, one single individual, group, bishop that forged these. We don't know who wrote these gospels. We just know who didn't write them. That's been the attitude all along. We don't know who wrote them. We just know who didn't write them. It's quite fascinating. They don't have a person of interest. We do. We've walked through all four gospels. We have multiple attestations that can be corroborated, both of church fathers or ancient documents or fragments. Internal evidence that demonstrates that their claims are true. That what they're saying about these gospels can be played out internally, not just externally. We don't just have an external gospel that can be demonstrated and proven. We can take the external claims and find out if they are correct. And we've done that in a very short way. There's more that we could be doing in these programs, but they're designated to be under an hour. We could do more. But just the simplest, greatest turnarounds we have in these gospels are showing us that they are not forgeries, that they can be identified to a source, that source did use certain material and perspectives, that they are based on eyewitness testimony. We've demonstrated that with all four gospels. If these gospels are forgeries, they are the greatest, most significant, most well done, thought out, thorough forgeries that have ever been written about a famous person in history. I mean, kudos to them, seriously, if this was simply based on forgers, because they are able to mimic details of events that the writer's claiming to be at, not big time in the sense of like, well, I'm John and I'm here, but through their code names, through the epithet that they give themselves, like Matthew. When you start seeing them on the scene, you see their writing skills, you see their abilities, you see their details, you see their influences, you see their backgrounds, and it just so happens to line up with the external claims we've dealt with. If these are forgeries, they're the best ever done. The best. These gospels, I believe, and have demonstrated and will continue to defend, are based on the eyewitness testimonies of those who were there. Maybe not one man. It could be a group like Matthew. It could be a group like John. And we see evidence of that. It could be a guy who traveled with Paul, who wanted to carry an account of the apostles with him and interviewed the eyewitnesses, like Luke. Or Peter, who was there, who preached sermons on it in Rome for years and eventually had it put to writing by John Mark. We see the inclusio eyewitness testimony. We see them. We see the ideal witnesses within it. We see the direct autopsies in these. We see the influence of the people in the stories and around the stories. And that's why the churches throughout the entire world only accepted, as Origen said, unquestionable amongst the churches under heaven, unquestionable as to which gospels were true. There's no debate. All four of the gospels that we have today were accepted and never questioned. Many were rejected because they did not contain all the things we've dealt with thus far. So these are exciting times. Exciting opportunities that we get to come and be a part of and investigate these things and explore these things. It's beautiful. And I trust that the Lord has used some of these sessions. And again, if you missed them, I really do ask. I really do ask that you consider and go back and listen to them if you need to. If you need some notes on it. If If you want a good book recommendation, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, I have it right here. I know those that are listening on Facts can't see it. Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, The Gospel as Eyewitness Testimony by Richard Bauckham. I've got the book right here. Excellent read. Read Burskog, Others. These are great. Tover, read Tover. These are great writings. There's good work being put out there and being reinvestigated. Don't let the skeptics tell us what the Gospels are and are not. Don't let liberal scholarship do that. Why should we let them dictate the origin of the Gospels that were delivered to the churches? If you're a part of the church, it is your responsibility to know what the church had to say about these things. And we need to be able to demonstrate it both externally and internally, as we've done in this show. I trust this has been a blessing to you. I trust you've learned from this. I've had multiple messages and emails and people reach out and give great feedback, and I appreciate that. Share these videos. Like these videos. Subscribe to the channel as we continue to go through Old and New Testament books and their authenticity. If you are listening for the first time, please join us in other scenery and other YouTube videos that we produce with interviews and debates. We invite you to subscribe to the channel and see what we have produced. Also, check us out on our website at explorechristianity.net. We have written articles, and we're involved in campuses, especially in Texas, speaking at conferences. I know we got a big one coming up in August. So keep tuned with what we're doing. If you like to continue to donate toward our ministry and what we're doing and the content we're producing, you can go on that website and do the same thing there at explorechristianity.net. You can donate. You can donate to the general assembly there, or you can donate to individuals. You can donate to people like myself or to Eric or to John or Jonathan. Feel free to check that out if you would as well. But like and subscribe and follow us for more things as it comes. If you have any other questions, you can always, after the video, leave a comment on YouTube or on Facebook, and I'll do my best to come back around. And I've got 3 minutes. I can take a question. An Ecclusio Eyewitness Testimony, Slam RN, a good question going back to what we dealt with in Mark. This is where the writer puts himself into the scene, particularly at the beginning of a writing, at the end of the writing, but makes himself out to be distant. So he's not involved in there by saying, I so-and-so. He actually puts the name there, but he makes sure to show that he is the star witness and writer by placing him first and last. He gets the first witness testimony in the scenery and the last, which is what happens in Mark's gospel. Peter is the first disciple in the scene. He's the last. Tell my brethren and tell Peter. He's first and the last. John does the same thing. He leaves himself anonymous, but he's the first one on the scene with Andrew. He's the last one on the scene in the end of the book. That is a form or an idea within the Ecclusio Eyewitness Testimony. If you miss more description and detail of that, you can go back to the second video I think we did on Mark's gospel. I give detail of that for Mark, but that's just kind of a quick, rapid answer. But it is a good question. Many other comments have come in the live stream. Appreciate that, guys and girls, for doing that. Again, like, share, subscribe. If you have any other questions, leave them at the end of the comments there, and I will come back and see them. Thank you again for tuning in. Make sure you check out the others if you have not, and stay tuned for more videos. I trust the Lord will give you a good week. Grace and